Did you know that some of the most mind-bending educational ideas from the medieval world, way back between the 5th and 15th centuries, are still shaping how you learn today? What if your school's focus on logic or hands-on skills actually dates back to knights and monks? Number 9. Education for women. Think about the world of the Middle Ages. It was a time often painted as super strict and traditional, especially for women. But even then, some surprising approaches to education for girls and women existed, showing that learning wasn't just for dudes in dusty libraries. It wasn't one giant unified philosophy, but rather distinct paths and purposes that shaped how women could gain knowledge. One big path was through the convent. For many noble or even well-off commoner women, entering a nunnery was a viable alternative to marriage, or a way to pursue spiritual devotion. These convents weren't just places of prayer. They were often centers of learning and culture. Inside their walls, women could learn to read and write, not just in Latin, which was the language of the church and scholars, but also in vernacular languages, their everyday tongue. They studied scripture, of course, but also theology, history, music, and even practical skills like manuscript illumination. A shining example of this kind of education is Hildegard von Bingen, a German abbess from the 12th century. She wasn't just a nun, she was a polymath. She wrote volumes on theology, medicine, natural science, composed beautiful music, and even had visions that she recorded. Her education within the Benedictine order allowed her to develop these incredible talents. She wasn't just absorbing information, she was creating new knowledge and expressing complex thoughts. Her works like Scivias and Physica show a mind deeply engaged with the world and divine mysteries, all cultivated within the walls of her convent. This kind of environment gave women a rare chance to engage intellectually in a world that largely kept them out of public intellectual life. Beyond the convent, wealthy, noble households sometimes provided education for their daughters. This wasn't about academic pursuits in the same way as a future scholar. It was more about preparing them for their roles as chatelaines, the ladies who managed vast estates, or as wives in politically important marriages. These girls learned to read and write, often to manage household accounts, read devotional texts, or write letters. They also learned music, embroidery, and sometimes even basic medicine or herbalism to care for their families and servants. The focus was on piety, domestic management, and the social graces needed to run a large household or be a suitable wife for a powerful lord. Consider Christine de Pizan, who lived in the late 14th and early 15th centuries. She was a truly exceptional figure. Born in Venice, she moved to France when her father, a court astrologer, joined the court of King Charles V. Her father believed in educating his daughter, something quite unusual for the time. He taught her Latin, history, and literature. When she became a widow early in life and needed to support her family, she turned to writing, becoming what many consider the first professional female writer in Europe. Her works, like the Book of the City of Ladies, challenged medieval stereotypes about women and argued for their intelligence and capacity for learning. Her own education, though informal and driven by her father's progressive views, allowed her to carve out an incredible career and advocate for women's worth in a powerful way for most commoner women. Formal schooling was rare. Their education was largely practical and vocational, learned at home from their mothers or other female relatives. They learned how to run a household, cook, spin, weave, sew, manage a garden, care for children, and assist with their family's trade, whether it was farming, baking, or craftwork. This was a hands-on apprenticeship style, learning crucial for survival and maintaining family livelihood. It wasn't about books or theories, but about immediate necessary skills that allowed families and communities to function. Even within these varied approaches, a common thread existed. Female education was often tied to moral development and piety. Whether in a convent or a noble home, Religious instruction was a cornerstone. Girls learned the prayers, stories of saints, and moral lessons from the Bible. This wasn't just about faith. It was also about shaping their character and ensuring they would be virtuous members of society. Their education was seen as a way to cultivate inner goodness and prepare them for their destined roles, whether in spiritual life or domestic life. The philosophy behind educating women, therefore, was largely pragmatic and tied to social roles, yet it offered surprising opportunities for intellectual growth and personal agency in certain contexts. It was a reflection of the medieval world's complex attitudes towards women, seeing them as capable of learning but often for specific prescribed purposes. The impact of figures like Hildegard von Bingen and Christine de Pizan reminds us that even when doors seemed closed, dedicated women and sometimes their supportive families found ways to unlock profound learning and influence their world. Number 8. Mystical education. Picture a kind of learning that doesn't happen in a classroom filled with books, but deep inside your mind and spirit. That's a bit like mystical education in the Middle Ages. It wasn't about memorizing facts or debating complex theories. It was about seeking a direct personal experience of God, a kind of knowledge that came from within, through intuition, contemplation, and spiritual exercises. This was a profoundly different way of understanding the world and the divine. Many of the great mystics were highly educated in traditional ways, often within monastic orders. They knew their scripture, their theology, and the writings of the church fathers. But for them, that academic knowledge was just the starting point. The real education began when they turned inward, seeking a union with the divine that transcended words and concepts. This was a path for those who felt that scholastic reason, while important, could only go so far in understanding the infinite. Consider Meister Eckhart, a German theologian and philosopher from the 13th and 14th centuries. He was a Dominican friar and a brilliant university master, teaching at Paris and Cologne. His sermons and treatises were full of complex philosophical and theological ideas, but at the heart of his teaching was the idea of the ground of the soul, a divine spark within each person that could directly experience God. His education wasn't about acquiring external knowledge, but about stripping away everything to find this inner truth. He encouraged his followers to practice detachment from worldly desires and even from their own thoughts, to create an emptiness where God could enter. This wasn't about passive waiting. It was an active discipline of mind and spirit, a rigorous process of self-emptying to allow for divine infusion of knowledge. Another fascinating example is Hadewijch of Antwerp, a Brabantine mystic from the 13th century. She was part of a group of laywomen known as beguines, who lived together without formal vows, dedicating themselves to a spiritual life. Her writings, which include letters, poems, and visions, describe an intense, passionate love for God, often using the language of courtly love to express the soul's yearning for divine union. Her education came from her deep spiritual experiences, which she meticulously recorded. She believed that true knowledge of God came from experiencing a fierce, consuming divine love, rather than simply studying about it. Her educational path was about experiencing, feeling, and intimately knowing the divine through the depths of her being. Mystical education often involved specific practices. Prayer, of course, was central, but not just rote prayer. It was contemplative prayer, where the mind focused on a single divine attribute or scripture verse until it transcended normal thought. Meditation was another key practice, often involving visualizing divine truths or entering states of deep concentration. Asceticism, or self-discipline, through fasting, vigils, and solitude, was also common. These weren't punishments. They were tools to purify the soul and make it more receptive to divine communication. The idea was that by quieting the noise of the world and the self one could hear the still, small voice of God. The goal of this education was not just intellectual understanding, but transformation of the self. It aimed to lead to what mystics called union with God, a state of profound spiritual oneness where the individual soul felt merged with the divine. This was considered the highest form of knowledge, a direct apprehension of ultimate truth that surpassed any amount of book learning or logical deduction. It was a knowing that changed the very being of the person. This type of education was deeply personal and often difficult to articulate in ordinary language. Mystics frequently used paradoxes, metaphors, and allegories to describe their experiences, because the truth they encountered went beyond the limits of human words. They were not trying to create a new philosophical system in the academic sense. They were guiding others towards a direct, inner path to knowledge. Even though it seems so different from modern schooling, the resonance of mystical education can be seen in the pursuit of inner wisdom, mindfulness practices, and the understanding that some truths are felt or experienced rather than just rationally understood. It was a powerful reminder that knowledge isn't always something you acquire from outside yourself. Sometimes it's something you uncover from deep within. Number 7. Realism versus nominalism. All right, imagine a super intense debate that shook the medieval universities to their core. It wasn't about who was going to win the next crusade or whether pineapples should go on pizza. It was about something way more abstract, but with huge consequences for how people understood knowledge itself. The battle between realism and nominalism. This wasn't a single philosophy, but a foundational disagreement about the nature of universals, and how you sided on it completely changed how you thought about teaching, learning, and reality. First, let's break down universals. Think about dog. You've seen lots of different dogs. Big ones, small ones, fluffy ones, short-haired ones. But what makes them all dog? Is there some perfect ideal dogness that exists independently of all the individual dogs you see? Or is dog just a word we use to group similar creatures together? This is the core of the universal problem. On one side you had the realists. Not realists in the modern sense of being practical or down to earth, but realists because they believed universals were real. They argued that dogness or humanity or redness existed independently, often in a divine mind or as forms that individual things participated in. Think back to Plato's ideas of forms, where a perfect chairness exists in a higher realm, and all the chairs we see are just imperfect copies. Medieval realists, like Anselm of Canterbury in the 11th century, believed that these universals were not just concepts in our minds, but actual things with their own existence. For them, general concepts were more fundamental than individual things. What did this mean for education? If universals were real, then learning was about discovering these pre-existing objective truths. When you studied humanity, you weren't just thinking about individual humans. You were contemplating the very essence of what it meant to be human, a universal reality. Education was about grasping these grand eternal truths that underpinned the world. It emphasized reason and intellectual contemplation to ascend to these higher forms of knowledge. When a teacher lectured on virtues, for example, they were speaking about universal virtues that existed, not just concepts in people's minds. It gave a strong sense of objective truth and certainty to knowledge. Then came the nominalists. These thinkers were on the other side. They argued that universals were not real things existing independently. Instead, they were just names or words, Latin, noumena, that we use to describe collections of individual things. For a nominalist, dogness doesn't exist out there somewhere. It's just a label we apply to all the different dogs we encounter because they share certain characteristics. There are only individual dogs, individual humans, individual red objects. William of Ockham, a Franciscan friar and philosopher from the 14th century, is perhaps the most famous nominalist. His idea, often called Occam's razor, basically said, don't multiply entities beyond necessity. If you can explain something with fewer assumptions, do it. For him, assuming a separate real existence for universals was unnecessary. We perceive individual things, and then our minds create concepts or words to group them. This was a radical idea that had massive implications for education. Nominalism shifted the focus. If only individuals were truly real, then knowledge started with observing and studying those individual things. It pushed for a more empirical approach, emphasizing the concrete, the particular, while realism might encourage grand philosophical deductions from universal principles. Nominalism encouraged looking at the specific facts and building understanding from there. It made categories and definitions seem less like discoveries of inherent truth and more like human constructs for organizing information. It also subtly moved toward skepticism about abstract concepts, questioning whether everything we could name actually existed in reality. The debate between these two camps was fierce and long-lasting, playing out in university lecture halls and theological disputes. It wasn't just an academic squabble. It touched on how humans understood God, creation, and their own place in the world. If universals were just names, what did that mean for the Church's authority in defining universal truths, or for the idea of a universal human nature created by God? These questions were huge. The resonance of this debate is surprisingly clear today. When you hear discussions about objective truth versus subjective experience, or the importance of empirical data versus theoretical frameworks, you're hearing echoes of realism and nominalism. Even in fields like computer science, the tension between abstract models and concrete instances has roots in this medieval argument. It taught medieval thinkers, and continues to teach us, to question the very foundation of how we know what we know, and whether the categories we use to understand the world are truly out there, or just handy tools of our own minds. It was a foundational argument that continues to shape our understanding of knowledge and reality. Number 6. Humanism's mythical roots. When you hear humanism, your mind probably jumps to the Renaissance, right? You picture Michelangelo painting the Sistine Chapel or Leonardo da Vinci sketching flying machines. Here's a secret. The seeds of humanism were already being planted and nurtured during the later Middle Ages. It wasn't a fully bloomed movement yet, but the way some thinkers were approaching education and knowledge hinted at a big shift coming. This proto-humanism was a quiet rebellion against some of the dominant academic trends of its time, focusing more on human potential and classical wisdom. Before the Renaissance exploded, medieval education, especially in universities, was heavily focused on theology and scholastic logic. The main goal was to understand God and divine truth, often through intricate debates and logical arguments. While super important, some thinkers felt something was missing. They started looking back, not just to the Church Fathers, but to the classical Greek and Roman authors: Cicero, Virgil, Seneca, Livy. These ancient writers were masters of rhetoric, history, poetry, and moral philosophy, and they offered a different kind of wisdom. This early humanistic philosophy of education emphasized the study of what were called the studia humanitatis, or humanities. This meant grammar, rhetoric, poetry, history, and moral philosophy. Notice what's missing: theology, law, medicine, and logic as the primary focus. The idea was to cultivate not just a learned scholar, but a virtuous and eloquent citizen. The goal was eloquentia cum sapientia, wisdom combined with eloquence. It wasn't enough to just know the truth. You had to be able to express it beautifully, and persuasively. Petrarch, living in the 14th century, is often called the father of humanism. And he's a perfect example of these medieval roots. He spent his life searching for and collecting ancient Latin manuscripts, rescuing works by Cicero and Livy from dusty monastic libraries. He didn't just collect them, he devoured them, writing letters to long-dead authors as if they were his contemporaries. Petrarch valued the moral philosophy and literary elegance of the ancients, seeing them as guides for living a good, virtuous life in this world, not just preparing for the next. His education was a deeply personal journey into classical antiquity, believing that studying these texts could make a person more fully human. He lamented the neglect of these texts in his own time and passionately advocated for their study. This emphasis on the classics wasn't just about reading old books. It was about developing certain skills and virtues. Rhetoric, the art of persuasive speaking and writing, became incredibly important. If you wanted to influence others, participate in civic life, or even write a compelling letter, you needed to be a master of language. History provided examples of human action, both good and bad, offering lessons for present and future conduct. Moral philosophy, from Seneca or Cicero, offered practical guidance on ethics and virtuous living that complemented Christian teachings but focused on earthly life. This approach to education valued the development of the whole person, their intellect, their character, and their ability to communicate effectively. It was about creating well-rounded individuals who could contribute to society, not just experts in a single, narrow field. While still deeply Christian, these early humanists believed that human excellence was achievable through diligent study and imitation of classical models. They saw no conflict between their faith and the wisdom of the ancients, believing that truth could be found in many places. The physical setting for this kind of education was often different too. While some humanists taught at universities, many were tutors in wealthy households or worked in civic chanceries, applying their rhetorical skills to state documents. They formed networks of scholars, sharing manuscripts and ideas, rather than always operating within rigid institutional structures. This informal network fostered a new kind of intellectual community. The resonance of this medieval humanism is all around us. The very idea of the humanities as a core part of education, aiming to cultivate critical thinking, communication skills, ethical reasoning, and an appreciation for culture directly comes from these early ideas. When we argue that studying literature or history helps us understand ourselves and the human experience better, we're echoing the aspirations of Petrarch and his contemporaries. It's a reminder that even when the main road seems to go one way, sometimes the most profound shifts in thinking start with individuals looking back to forgotten wisdom and finding a new path forward. Number 5. Guild apprenticeship. Forget about dusty books and long lectures for a minute during the Middle Ages. If you wanted to become a skilled craftsperson, a shoemaker, a blacksmith, a carpenter, a baker, or a tailor, your education looked totally different. It was about hands-on learning, practical skills, and mastering a trade. This system was called guild apprenticeship, and it was one of the most widespread and effective educational philosophies of its time, preparing people not for scholarly debates, but for real-world work. Guilds were like powerful medieval trade unions, combined with social clubs and quality control associations. They protected their members, regulated their craft, and, crucially, controlled who could practice the trade and how new members were trained. If you wanted to join a craft, you couldn't just open a shop. You had to go through the rigorous apprenticeship system. The core of this educational philosophy was learning by doing. A young person, often a boy but sometimes a girl in certain trades like brewing or textiles, would be formally bound to a master craftsman for a set number of years, usually 7, but it could vary from 5 to 12. This was like a contract, often signed in front of witnesses, outlining the master's responsibilities to teach and the apprentice's duties. The apprentice would live in the master's home, becoming part of the household, and in exchange for their labor, they received food, lodging, and most importantly, instruction in the trade. The learning process was gradual and immersive. An apprentice started with the most basic, often tedious tasks: cleaning the workshop, running errands, preparing materials. They watched the master and his journeymen, those who had completed their apprenticeship but weren't yet masters, at work. Slowly, they would be allowed to assist with simple tasks, gradually progressing to more complex ones. They learned the tools, the materials, the techniques, and the secrets of the trade through constant observation, practice, and repetition. For example, a young apprentice to a stonemason wouldn't start by carving intricate gargoyles. They'd likely begin by fetching stones, mixing mortar, and learning to rough-cut simple blocks. Over time, they'd move to shaping, then to more detailed carving, learning about different types of stone, how to read architectural plans, and even basic geometry needed for construction. The master directly supervised their work, correcting mistakes and demonstrating proper methods. There were no textbooks or formal exams, just direct instruction and continuous practical assessment. The master was responsible not just for teaching the craft, but often for the apprentice's moral and religious upbringing as well. They were expected to treat the apprentice fairly, teach them good manners, and ensure they attended church. This holistic approach meant that the apprenticeship was not just vocational training, but also a form of character development and social integration. After completing their apprenticeship, the young person would become a journeyman. This meant they were skilled enough to work for wages, often traveling from town to town. Journey comes from the French word for day, indicating daily wages, to gain experience with different masters and styles. This period allowed them to refine their skills and gain a broader perspective on their craft. The final step to becoming a master was often creating a masterpiece. This was a significant piece of work, demonstrating the journeyman's complete mastery of the craft. It would be judged by the existing masters of the guild. If it passed, the journeyman could then open their own workshop, take on their own apprentices, and become a full member of the guild. This was a rigorous system of quality control, ensuring that only the most skilled individuals were recognized as masters. The philosophy behind guild apprenticeship was that true mastery came from long-term, supervised practical experience. It valued skill over abstract knowledge, repetition over rote memorization, and hands-on competence over theoretical understanding. It was a system that provided economic stability, transferred essential skills across generations, and ensured a high standard of craftsmanship in medieval society. The resonance of this educational philosophy is undeniable. Modern vocational training programs, internships, and even many aspects of medical residencies echo the core principles of guild apprenticeship. The idea that deep knowledge and true competence come from direct, sustained engagement with a craft or profession under the guidance of experienced practitioners is a timeless educational concept. It shows that learning isn't always about sitting in a lecture hall. Sometimes it's about getting your hands dirty and building something amazing, one careful step at a time. Number 4, chivalric training. Forget what you think you know from Hollywood movies about knights. Becoming a knight in the Middle Ages wasn't just about swinging a sword. It was a rigorous, lifelong educational philosophy that shaped young men into what was considered the ideal warrior leader and gentleman of the time. This system, known as chivalric training, focused on martial prowess, moral virtues, and courtly manners, creating a distinct approach to education for the elite. This wasn't an education you got in a classroom. It started very young, often around the age of 7, when a noble boy would be sent away from his family home to live in the household of another lord, often a relative or a powerful feudal overlord. Here he would begin as a page. This period was about learning the ropes of courtly life and beginning his physical conditioning. Pages learned table manners, how to serve in the Lord's hall, basic literacy sometimes, and religious instruction. They were taught to respect authority, speak politely, and understand the social hierarchy. Physical training included running, jumping, wrestling, and learning to ride horses, though not yet in armor. They might also learn falconry or hunting skills, crucial for noble life and warfare. Around the age of 14, the page would advance to become a squire. This was where the serious military and practical training began. The squire became the personal attendant to a knight, serving him in battle, during tournaments, and in daily life. This was the ultimate apprenticeship. Squires learned how to care for armor, weapons, and horses. They helped their knight don his heavy armor, ensuring every piece was in place. They carried the knight's shield and spare weapons into battle, helped him if he was dismounted, and even risked their own lives to protect him. Beyond serving, squires received direct instruction in combat. They practiced with various weapons: sword, lance, axe, dagger. They learned horsemanship, not just riding, but fighting from horseback, maneuvering in formation, and charging. They trained in mock combat, often using blunted weapons to build strength, agility, and tactical understanding. This training was physically demanding and often dangerous, but it was essential for survival on the battlefield. But chivalric training was about more than just fighting. It deeply ingrained a code of conduct called chivalry. This code, often romanticized later, was a real and important part of their education. It emphasized virtues like courage, loyalty, honor, courtesy, generosity, and justice. Squires were taught to protect the weak, defend the church, uphold justice, and be true to their word. They learned about religious devotion and the importance of pilgrimage. Courtly love, a complex set of behaviors and attitudes regarding ideal love and devotion, also became part of their education, teaching them manners, respect, and perhaps even poetry or music. The expectation was that a knight should not only be a fierce warrior, but also a virtuous and cultured individual. The ideal of chivalry was promoted through stories, songs, and poems known as chansons de geste, songs of heroic deeds, and romances. These tales, like the legends of King Arthur and his knights, provided models of heroic behavior, moral dilemmas, and the virtues a true knight should embody. These stories were a powerful part of their moral education, showing them what it meant to live up to the lofty ideals of knighthood. Finally, usually in their late teens or early 20s, after years of rigorous training and proving their worth, a squire might be formally knighted in a solemn ceremony. This act officially recognized their completion of the intensive chivalric education and their readiness to take on the full responsibilities and privileges of knighthood. Ramon Llull, a Catalan philosopher from the 13th century, wrote the Book of the Order of Chivalry, which laid out the duties and ideals of a knight. He detailed the spiritual, moral, and martial responsibilities, emphasizing the knight's role as a defender of faith and justice, not just a mercenary. This book served as a guide, almost a textbook, for the philosophical underpinnings of chivalric education. The resonance of chivalric training is found in many places today. The concept of a professional military officer corps, trained not just in combat, but also in leadership, ethics, and civic duty, echoes the comprehensive nature of chivalric ideals. The emphasis on character development, loyalty, and service, combined with practical skills, remains a powerful model for leadership training. It reminds us that education, especially for those in positions of power, must go beyond mere technical skills to instill a strong moral compass and a sense of purpose. Number 3. Monastic learning. Imagine a place where the pursuit of knowledge wasn't about earning a degree or a fancy job, but about serving God and preserving ancient wisdom. That was the core of monastic learning in the Middle Ages. Monasteries and convents weren't just places of prayer. They were beacons of scholarship, culture, and literacy during centuries when much of Europe was facing turmoil. This educational philosophy valued spiritual devotion, meticulous copying of texts, and the contemplative life of study. After the collapse of the Western Roman Empire, much of the classical learning and literacy that had flourished in the Roman world began to fade. Cities declined, trade routes were disrupted, and the institutions that supported learning, like public schools, largely disappeared. It was in this fragmented world that monasteries stepped up, becoming the primary guardians of knowledge. The Benedictine rule, written by Saint Benedict of Nursia in the 6th century, was incredibly influential in shaping monastic life and learning. It prescribed a balanced routine of prayer, work, and study. Ora et labora, pray and work, was the motto. Within this structured life, copying manuscripts became a form of prayer and a vital work. The scriptoria, or writing rooms of monasteries, were bustling centers where monks and nuns painstakingly copied, preserved, and illuminated texts. Without them, countless works of classical literature, philosophy, and early Christian writings would have been lost forever. Consider Cassiodorus, a Roman statesman who in the 6th century founded the Vivarium Monastery in southern Italy. He explicitly designed it as a center for Christian learning and the preservation of classical texts. He encouraged his monks not only to copy scriptures, but also the works of pagan authors, recognizing their value for education and culture. He compiled a work called the Institutions of Divine and Secular Letters, which guided his monks on how to study and organize knowledge, outlining the proper curriculum for both sacred and profane texts. This was essentially a medieval syllabus for monastic education, emphasizing the liberal arts as a foundation for understanding Christian doctrine. The education within a monastery was primarily for those who joined the order. Young oblates, children dedicated to the monastery, and adult converts learned to read and write, mostly in Latin, the language of the Church. They studied scripture, theology, liturgy, and the writings of the Church Fathers. This education was geared towards understanding their faith, performing liturgical duties, and engaging in theological reflection. Beyond the spiritual texts, monks and nuns also studied the 7 liberal arts, which we will discuss more deeply later. These included the trivium, grammar, rhetoric, logic, and the quadrivium, arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, music. These subjects were seen as necessary tools for understanding Scripture and the divine order of the universe. For instance, astronomy helped them calculate the dates for religious festivals like Easter, and music was essential for chanting divine services. Monastic libraries became treasure troves of knowledge. They didn't just store books. They were living centers of study. Scholars within these communities wrote commentaries, treatises, and histories. Bede, an English monk from the 7th and 8th centuries, was an extraordinary scholar who spent his life in the monastery of Monkwearmouth, Jarrow. He wrote the Ecclesiastical History of the English People, a foundational work for understanding early English history. His education was entirely monastic, and his work demonstrates the high intellectual standards and deep learning fostered within these communities. He synthesized diverse sources, applied critical thinking, and meticulously organized his knowledge. Monasteries also served as educational centers for the wider community to some extent. While not public schools in the modern sense, they sometimes offered elementary instruction to lay people, especially noble children, or served as places where aspiring priests received their basic training. Their primary purpose, however, remained the spiritual and intellectual development of their own members. The philosophy of monastic learning was deeply rooted in the belief that knowledge was a path to God. By copying texts, monks were not just preserving information, they were engaging in a holy act. By studying, they were contemplating the divine. It was a humble, disciplined, and often solitary pursuit of wisdom, driven by piety and a profound sense of duty to tradition and the sacred word. The resonance of monastic learning is powerful. The idea of learning for its own sake, driven by intrinsic motivation and a deep respect for tradition, echoes in many modern educational philosophies. The value placed on meticulous scholarship, the preservation of cultural heritage, and the importance of quiet contemplation in the pursuit of knowledge are all legacies of these ancient learning communities. Even today, the image of a library as a sacred space for quiet study and reflection owes a debt to the medieval monasteries that kept the flame of learning alive through the darkest of times. Number 2. Scholasticism. If the Middle Ages had a flagship educational philosophy, one that shaped universities and intellectual thought for centuries, it was scholasticism. This wasn't just a subject, it was a method, a way of thinking, and a grand project to harmonize faith and reason. Imagine smart people in medieval universities using logic and rigorous debate to understand divine truths in the natural world. That's scholasticism in a nutshell. It truly blossomed from the 11th century onwards, especially with the rise of universities in places like Paris, Oxford, and Bologna. These new institutions needed a systematic way to teach theology, philosophy, and law, and scholasticism provided the framework. Its primary goal was to reconcile Christian theology with classical philosophy, particularly the works of Aristotle, which were rediscovered in Latin translations during this period. Core method of scholasticism was the disputatio, disputation or debate. This was more than just arguing. It was a highly structured, formal process of intellectual inquiry. A master would pose a question, often a complex theological or philosophical problem like, does God exist? Or can one person be wiser than another? Students would then present arguments for and against the proposition, drawing on authoritative texts, scripture, church fathers, classical philosophers. The master would then synthesize the arguments, resolve the apparent contradictions, and offer a definitive solution. This wasn't about winning an argument. It was about arriving at truth through rigorous logical reasoning. The structure of scholastic texts, like Thomas Aquinas' Summa Theologica, reflects this method. Each article starts with a question, then presents arguments, objection 1, objection 2, followed by an argument on the contrary, often quoting a different authority. Then comes, I answer that, where Aquinas lays out his reasoned solution, often distinguishing different meanings of terms or clarifying concepts. Finally, he responds to each of the initial objections, showing why they don't hold up in light of his solution. This highly organized, systematic approach was a hallmark of scholastic education. Logic and dialectic were the absolute backbone of scholasticism. Students spent years mastering these tools, which were part of the trivium: grammar, rhetoric, logic. They learned how to construct valid arguments, identify fallacies, define terms precisely, and draw distinctions. This training made their minds incredibly sharp and critical, even if the subjects seem distant to us today. The ability to break down a complex problem into its component parts, analyze different perspectives, and synthesize them into a coherent argument was a highly valued skill. The key figures in scholasticism are towering intellectuals. Anselm of Canterbury, 11th century, is famous for his ontological argument for God's existence and his phrase, fides quaerens intellectum, faith seeking understanding, which perfectly sums up the scholastic project. He believed that faith came first, but reason could then be used to deepen and confirm that faith. Then there's the colossal figure of Thomas Aquinas, 13th century. He was a Dominican friar who taught at the University of Paris. His Summa Theologica is an immense work that attempts to systematically address almost every theological and philosophical question of his time using the scholastic method. Aquinas famously integrated the philosophy of Aristotle into Christian thought, showing how reason, as developed by Aristotle, could serve as a powerful tool for understanding divine revelation. He believed there were two paths to truth: divine revelation, faith, and human reason, and that these two paths could not ultimately contradict each other because both originated from God. This educational philosophy trained students to be precise thinkers, skilled in argumentation and analysis. It valued clarity, coherence, and the ability to systematically explore complex ideas. It prepared them for careers in the church law and administration, where logical reasoning and persuasive argument were essential. While some later critics saw scholasticism as overly rigid or obsessed with minute distinctions, its impact on Western thought and education is immense. The very structure of academic inquiry, the emphasis on reasoned argument, the use of systematic analysis, and the critical evaluation of sources all owe a huge debt to the scholastic method. The idea that faith and reason are not necessarily opposed and can even complement each other in the pursuit of truth remains a vital concept. Scholasticism taught that rigorous intellectual discipline was not just for professional philosophers, but for anyone seeking a deeper understanding of the world and their place in it. Number 1. The 7 liberal arts. If you attended a medieval school or university, whether in a monastery, a cathedral school, or a burgeoning university, there's one curriculum that would have been your absolute bread and butter: the 7 liberal arts. This wasn't just a list of subjects. It was a foundational educational philosophy that aimed to cultivate a free person, someone capable of participating in civic life, understanding the world, and preparing for higher studies in theology, law, or medicine. It was the backbone of medieval education, shaping minds for over 1,000 years. The idea of the liberal arts wasn't new to the Middle Ages. It had roots in ancient Greece and Rome. Medieval scholars simply adapted and formalized it. They divided these 7 arts into 2 main groups. First came the trivium, meaning 3 ways. These were the arts of the word, focusing on language and communication. Grammar. This was more than just knowing parts of speech. It was the study of Latin language and literature, learning to read, write, and understand texts correctly. Students studied classical authors like Virgil and Cicero, learning vocabulary, syntax, and literary analysis. It was about developing a clear and precise understanding of language, which was the key to all other knowledge. Rhetoric, the art of persuasive speaking and writing. Students learned how to construct compelling arguments, write eloquent speeches, and communicate effectively. They studied rhetorical devices, logical fallacies, and the art of persuasion, often using models from ancient Roman orators like Cicero. This was essential for anyone hoping to participate in public life, legal debates, or preach effectively. Logic, or dialectic, this was the absolute powerhouse of the trivium. It was the art of reasoning, understanding valid arguments, and identifying fallacies. Students learned how to define terms, make distinctions, and analyze arguments. This training was crucial for later theological and philosophical studies, teaching students to think critically and systematically. It was the foundation for the rigorous debates of scholasticism. Mastering the trivium was like learning how to think, how to express thoughts clearly, and how to analyze the arguments of others. It built the fundamental skills for intellectual inquiry. Once a student had a solid grasp of the trivium, they moved on to the quadrivium, meaning 4 ways. These were the arts of number, focusing on mathematics and the natural world. Arithmetic, not just basic counting, but the study of number theory, the properties of numbers and their relationships. It was often explored in a more philosophical and abstract way, sometimes with mystical or theological interpretations. Geometry, the study of shapes, lines, angles, and spatial relationships. This went beyond simple measurements to include principles of geometry, often based on Euclid's Elements. It was important for architecture, land measurement, and understanding the physical world. Astronomy, the study of the stars, planets, and celestial movements. This was crucial for calculating the dates of religious festivals, understanding the cosmos as God's creation, and sometimes for practical navigation. It often combined scientific observation with astrological beliefs. Music. This wasn't just about playing instruments. It was the theoretical study of musical harmony ratios and the mathematical principles behind music. It was often seen as connected to arithmetic and astronomy, reflecting the divine order and harmony of the universe. The philosophy behind the 7 liberal arts was that these subjects provided the essential knowledge and skills necessary for a truly educated person, a person who was liberal or free, capable of exercising their mind and participating fully in society. They were seen as preparatory studies, the necessary groundwork before delving into the higher faculties of theology, law, or medicine. Boethius, a Roman philosopher from the 5th and 6th centuries, was hugely influential in transmitting the knowledge of the liberal arts from the classical world into the Middle Ages. His works, particularly his commentaries on logic and his treatises on arithmetic and music, became standard textbooks for centuries. He essentially helped lay out the curriculum that would define medieval education. Even Charlemagne, the powerful emperor of the Franks in the 8th and 9th centuries, promoted the liberal arts during the Carolingian Renaissance. He brought scholars like Alcuin of York to his court to establish schools and reform education, aiming to revive learning and literacy across his empire, with the liberal arts at the heart of the curriculum for clergy and administrators. The resonance of the 7 liberal arts is profound and continues to shape education today. The very concept of a liberal arts education in modern universities, emphasizing critical thinking, broad knowledge across disciplines, and effective communication, is a direct descendant of this medieval framework. The value placed on understanding language, logical reasoning, mathematical principles, and an appreciation for the order of the universe all trace back to these ancient and medieval educational ideals. It reminds us that fundamental skills of thinking and communicating are timeless and essential for any well-rounded life.